The blinding lights of the octagon shone down on the fighting surface as tens of thousands of fans leaped to their feet in non-stop roaring screams. When the cage door opened and Vitor Belfort stepped in, the entire arena seemed to hold its breath. In UFC history, very few fighters have ever appeared with the speed and power that made opponents crumble so quickly like he did. People called him the Phenom, one of the rarest phenomena in MMA. In 1997, at just 19 years old, Belfort entered the UFC 12 heavyweight tournament and stunned the entire world by taking out two opponents in the same night to win the tournament championship. His striking speed became legendary. Those knockout wins in mere dozens of seconds against names like Wanderlei Silva or Tank Abbott made him one of the most feared fighters in the early days of the UFC. He didn't stop there. Belfort continued to cement his status by capturing the UFC light heavyweight championship in 2004 after defeating Randy Couture. Over more than 2 decades of competing, he faced the biggest legends in MMA like Anderson Silva, Dan Henderson, Michael Bisping, and Luke Rockhold, and multiple times left the whole world stunned with his explosive knockouts. The titles, awards, and millions of fans worldwide turned Belfort into an icon of the UFC, one of the most influential fighters in MMA history. But all that glory only tells half the story. Behind the image of an unbeatable warrior was a man who has carried pain for decades. When the cameras turned off and the crowd left the stands, Belfort returned to his second life, a life shaped by family tragedy, by the haunting obsession over the disappearance of the sister he loved most. That disappearance didn't just tear the Belfort family apart, it left a void in him that could never be filled. While the world saw a ferocious fighter with lightning-fast knockouts, inside he was a man wrestling with pain, faith, and questions that had no answers. For the past 30 years, Vitor Belfort has lived 2 parallel lives, one of fame, power, and the blazing lights of the UFC, and a quiet one where he tries to hold on to faith, protect his family, and find meaning amid losses that no victory can ever erase. That very contrast is what has shaped the real Belfort, a warrior who doesn't just fight inside the cage, but also battles the deepest wounds in his own heart. If the story behind Vitor Belfort's lights surprised you, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can explore the full, eventful journey of this extraordinary fighter together. Rio de Janeiro, in the late 1970s, was a city full of contradictions. The city sat between stunning beaches, green mountains casting shadows over the ocean, and neighborhoods where samba music echoed all night long. To many people outside Brazil, Rio seemed like paradise, but for the kids growing up there, especially during the turbulent times in the country, Rio was also a place that held a different reality: instability, violence, and the feeling that life could change in just a single moment. It was in that dazzling yet fragile city that on April 1, 1977, Vitor Vieira Belfort was born. The Belfort family was not poor. His father, José Belfort, was a businessman involved in advertising and media. His mother, Maria José Belfort, was a strong, educated woman who always tried to keep her family steady amid a rapidly changing society. They belonged to Rio's middle class, comfortable enough to give their children a relatively stable life. But even that stability couldn't separate them from the tense atmosphere that blanketed the city. The streets of Rio could be beautiful during the day, but when night fell, everything could turn completely different. News of robberies, gangs, and violence came up constantly. Kids growing up there learned early that the world wasn't always safe, and Vitor Belfort was no exception. From a young age, he felt the invisible pressure of his surroundings. It wasn't a fear spoken out loud, but a quiet sense that to survive, a person had to become tougher than what they really felt inside. The kids in the neighborhood often played soccer on the streets, running and jumping between buildings and narrow alleys. But sometimes all it took was a police siren, an argument breaking out among adults, or a story about someone getting attacked on the road to remind them that the world wasn't entirely kind. In that atmosphere, Vitor grew up faster than his years. The boy had bright eyes and a body full of energy, but deep down he still had a sensitive soul. People who knew the Belfort family later often said that young Vitor wasn't an aggressive child. On the contrary, he was quite quiet and observed more than he spoke. Maybe that's why, in his world, the most important person was his older sister. Priscilla Belfort was a few years older than Vitor. To outsiders, she was simply the sister of an energetic boy. But to Vitor, Priscilla was his entire world. She wasn't just family, she was his first friend, his first protector, and the only one who truly understood the boy behind the tough exterior that people would later see. When Vitor was little, Priscilla was often the one who spent the most time with him. She helped him with homework, pulled him out of childish fights, and sometimes just sat and listened to him talk about the small things of the day. In a city where everything could turn chaotic so quickly, Priscilla was like a peaceful shelter for her little brother. She had a strong yet gentle personality. When Vitor was scared, she was the one who told him everything would be okay. When he was disappointed or sad, she was the one who made him laugh again. In the many years that followed, when Belfort had become a famous fighter, he repeatedly said that his sister was one of the biggest influences in his childhood. Not because she taught him how to fight, but because she taught him how to love and protect the people he cared about. However, Vitor's childhood wasn't just warm memories. The city around him constantly reminded him that life wasn't easy. Social pressures, stories of street violence, and the feeling that a man had to be strong to survive gradually shaped his thinking. The boys in the neighborhood often talked about strength, about who could fight better, who could protect themselves better. Even though Vitor wasn't someone who liked starting trouble, he understood one thing very early. If he wanted to survive in this world, he had to learn how to stand firm. That very feeling quietly led him toward martial arts later on. But back in those childhood years, Vitor Belfort was still just a boy growing up amid the beauty and instability of Rio de Janeiro, a boy with a family, warm dinners, laughter in the house, and above all, a boy with his sister Priscilla, who always stood by his side, like a small but enduring light in a world still full of shadows. No one in the Belfort family back then could have imagined that many years later, that deep bond would become the biggest wound in Vitor's life. No one knew that the boy growing up on the streets of Rio, who would later become one of the most feared fighters in UFC history, would also be the one carrying a pain that not even victory could erase. And no one knew that, right from those early years, the seeds of Vitor Belfort's two-faced life had already begun to be sown quietly. One side was the strength the world would see. The other side was the fear and family love that only those closest to him would understand. But at that moment, all of that was still far in the future. Back then, Vitor was just a boy in Rio, running on the warm streets of the seaside city, believing that his family would always be together forever. And that was the innocent belief that life would later test in the most painful ways. Vitor Belfort's childhood passed on the sunny streets of Rio de Janeiro. But as he entered his early teenage years, something inside him began to change. The boy who had once been quiet and observed more than he spoke started to feel the pressure of the world around him more clearly. Rio was still beautiful, still noisy with music and the sound of ocean waves, but behind that beauty was a truth that any child growing up in this city soon understood. Life wasn't always kind, and it was in that very atmosphere that Vitor Belfort began to find his first path, martial arts. At first, everything came very simply. Belfort started training in boxing when he was still very young. It wasn't because his family forced him or because he dreamed of becoming a famous fighter. It was just a way to release the energy of a boy who always felt something boiling up inside him. In the small gyms of Rio, where the smell of sweat and the sound of gloves hitting heavy bags echoed non-stop, Belfort began to learn his first lessons about fighting. How to stand firm, how to keep balance, how to throw a fast and precise punch. At first, no one thought this boy would become anything special. But after only a short time, the trainers started to notice something unusual. Vitor wasn't just strong. He was fast to a frightening degree. His punches came almost without warning. While other kids were still trying to learn how to keep their footwork in rhythm, Belfort was already unleashing combinations so quick that his opponents couldn't react in time. It wasn't just muscular power. It was an instinct that very few fighters possess. However, boxing was only the beginning. Not long after, Belfort was introduced to a much deeper and more complex world of martial arts, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In those years, Jiu-Jitsu was becoming Brazil's pride, a martial art that relied not just on strength but on technique, patience, and the ability to control an opponent. And it was here that Belfort began training under one of the most important names in the history of the art, Carlson Gracie. For a very young boy, stepping into Carlson Gracie's gym was like entering a completely different world. The fighters there didn't just train, they lived martial arts. They understood every small movement, every lock, every way to move on the mat. And Belfort, with his natural speed and fighting instinct, quickly became a special student. Carlson Gracie was the one who saw what many others hadn't yet realized. He saw in this boy not just a potential fighter, but a born warrior. In the gym, Belfort wasn't the biggest, but he moved faster than almost everyone. When other fighters were still thinking about their next step, Belfort was already striking. When others were still looking for a way to escape a hold, Belfort had already shifted to offense. The people training with him started saying something to each other that many in the martial arts world still remember today. This kid hits so fast it's scary. But what few understood at the time was that martial arts for Belfort wasn't just a sport. For many in the gym, martial arts was passion, competition, a path to becoming champion. But for Vitor Belfort, it was something deeper. Martial arts was the place where he could escape the fears he didn't know how to name. When he stepped onto the mat, everything in Belfort's head became clearer. No more city noise. No more stories of street violence. No more fragile feeling that the world could collapse at any moment. On the training floor, everything was simple. There was an opponent in front of him. There was a clear goal. There was a way to win. And there was something more important than anything. There, Belfort felt strong. The once quiet boy began to change. His body grew tougher, his reflexes sharper, and confidence gradually appeared in every step he took. But even as he was learning how to fight, Belfort never lost the sensitive part of himself inside. His trainers later recalled that he wasn't the type of fighter who liked starting trouble. He didn't seek conflict outside the gym. On the contrary, he often stayed quiet and observed, only exploding when he stepped onto the mat. That very contrast made Belfort a puzzling figure to many people. In the gym, he was a warrior. Outside, he was still the Rio boy with a family, with his sister Priscilla always watching over her little brothers every step. Priscilla was often the one who listened to Belfort talk about his training sessions, about the new submissions he'd learned, about the times he surprised older fighters. She was proud of her brother, but she also always reminded him that true strength wasn't just about beating others. It was about knowing who you are. Those words back then were probably just simple conversations between siblings. But many years later, when Belfort's life went through events no one could have imagined, those very memories became what helped him stay balanced. At that point, everything was still very early. Vitor Belfort was still just a teenager growing up amid long training sessions, vague dreams, and the belief that martial arts could open a different path for his life. No one in Carlson Gracie's gym back then could know that the boy with hands so fast they were scary would soon step onto a much bigger stage, a stage where millions of people would come to know the name Vitor Belfort. But along with the lights of fame would also come challenges and pain that no gym could ever prepare him for. And that journey was drawing closer every day. The years of training in Carlson Gracie's gym gradually turned the Rio teenager into a real fighter. But even as Vitor Belfort began winning small fights in local tournaments, no one in the gym at that time could have imagined how quickly his life was about to change. MMA in the mid-1990s was still a chaotic, almost wild world. The UFC back then wasn't the massive sports organization it would later become. It was more like a violent experiment, fighters from different martial arts stepping into the octagon to see who was truly the strongest. There weren't many rules. There wasn't the protection we have today. Fights often ended in scenes that left audiences both amazed and terrified. And it was in that chaotic world that a 19-year-old kid from Brazil was about to step in. In 1997, Vitor Belfort got the opportunity most young fighters only dared to dream of, competing at UFC 12. To many people, it was a crazy decision. Belfort was too young. His opponents were bigger, heavier, and way more experienced. Some in the martial arts world even said outright that this kid could get crushed in just a few minutes. But when the octagon door closed that night, all the predictions started to crumble. His first fight happened so fast that many fans barely had time to understand what was going on. Belfort charged forward the moment the fight started, unleashing a flurry of punches with a speed that the TV cameras of the time could barely capture. His opponent tried to defend, but just seconds later he was down on the mat. The referee rushed in to stop it. The fight was over. The entire arena fell into a brief silence, as if everyone was trying to process what had just happened. But that was only the beginning. Because UFC 12 was a tournament format, Belfort had to fight one more time that same night. When he stepped into the second fight, many fans thought this opponent would be more cautious. But what happened was almost identical to the first one. Belfort attacked immediately. Punches flew like lightning. In just a few dozen seconds, the second opponent was also down on the mat. This time, there was no silence. The whole arena exploded. Fans leaped to their feet. The commentators were practically yelling in shock. In just one night, a 19-year-old kid had forced the entire UFC to take notice. That was the moment the world first heard the name Vitor Belfort. But more importantly, it was the moment a nickname was born. The Phenomenon. Not just because he won. UFC had seen plenty of fighters win before, but no one had won like this. Belfort's speed made everything extraordinary. His punches weren't like other fighters. They were fast, precise, and explosive to the point that opponents had almost no chance to react. Overnight, Belfort became the topic of discussion throughout the entire martial arts world. Newspapers started writing about the Brazilian kid with the fastest hands in MMA. UFC organizers saw in him a new star, a young explosive fighter full of energy with a fighting style that kept audiences glued to the screen. To American fans, Belfort was like a sudden storm. An unknown fighter steps into the cage and in just minutes changes the way people see the sport. But inside Belfort, things weren't that simple. When the crowd's cheers died down, when the TV lights faded and the reporters left the backstage area, that 19-year-old kid was still just a young man trying to understand what had just happened to his life. Fame came too fast. Just a few months earlier, Belfort had been a young fighter training in a gym in Brazil. Now he was one of the most talked-about names in the UFC. Interviews started appearing. Fight offers came from everywhere. Journalists wanted to know the story of MMA's new phenomenon, but Belfort at that time still didn't really know who he was in this new world. He was a young fighter with rare talent, but also a guy who had just stepped into adulthood. People who were close to Belfort back then later said he was both excited and confused. Excited because his martial arts dream seemed to be unfolding right in front of him, but confused because everything was happening so fast. In the eyes of the fans, Belfort had become a terrifying warrior, a knockout machine. But inside, he still carried the memories of the Rio boy who trained in Carlson Gracie's gym, who ran home to tell his sister Priscilla about the day's training. And right there, a quiet truth began to take shape in Belfort's life. The world saw him as a warrior, but he himself was still trying to figure out who he really was. Those two images started to exist side by side. On one side was the Phenom, the fighter who stunned the entire UFC. On the other was Vitor, the young guy still carrying questions about life, about fame, and about the path he was walking. That was the beginning of a life that Belfort would later have to learn how to balance. A life where the lights of fame shone very brightly, but the dark corners of the soul still existed. And while the whole world began to love the Phenom, it was actually Vitor Belfort at that moment who didn't truly understand who he was becoming. But back then, no one was thinking about those things. All the world saw was a new phenomenon in the UFC. A 19-year-old kid with hands so fast they were scary. A fighter who stepped into the octagon and in just minutes changed the way people looked at power, speed, and explosiveness in MMA. That night, the UFC had found a new star, and the name Vitor Belfort began to enter the history of the sport. But like many stories of fame, it was also the night when a much longer and more complicated journey began. A journey where the light of victory would always come alongside challenges, doubts, and pains that no one in the arena that night could have imagined. And for Vitor Belfort, the boy who once learned to fight to escape his fears, the real battle of his life was still ahead. The night that Vitor Belfort stunned the entire UFC changed his life in ways that even he himself hadn't fully grasped yet. Just a few weeks after UFC 12, the name Belfort started appearing in sports magazines, on martial arts TV shows, and in conversations among MMA fans all across America. A 19-year-old kid from Rio de Janeiro, who just a few months earlier was still training in the sweltering gyms of Brazil, had now become a global phenomenon. The UFC at that time was in a phase of searching for stars who could bring the sport closer to the mainstream public, and Belfort, with his terrifying striking speed and explosive fighting style, quickly became the perfect face for that role. The media called him the Phenom, with almost frenzied excitement. His knockout highlight videos were played and replayed on television. Promoters began advertising fights featuring Belfort as must-see events for fans. To the audience, he was like a bolt of lightning in the MMA world, fast, ferocious, and completely unpredictable. Along with the fame came things that most 19-year-old guys had never experienced. Money started flowing in, bigger fight contracts, invitations to events, constant flights back and forth between Brazil and the United States. Suddenly, Belfort's life no longer revolved around simple training sessions in the gym. It became a whirlwind of media, expectations, and attention from everywhere. To outsiders, it looked like the perfect dream, a young man becoming a star overnight. But for Belfort, that feeling was far more complicated, because beneath all those lights and roaring crowds, he was still just the boy from Rio. The boy who once ran through the hot streets of the seaside city, who once told his sister Priscilla about his very first training sessions. Fame arrived so fast that he hadn't had time to prepare for it. Every time he stepped into a big arena, Belfort saw thousands of fans chanting his name. They expected one thing only: another knockout, another explosive moment. But inside, he was still trying to figure himself out. Many fighters who achieve early success have a clear plan for the future. They know they want to become champion, how they want to build their legacy. But for Belfort at 19, everything felt like a tornado. He won fights, he got praised, he was called a phenomenon. But he still didn't really understand what the life of a martial arts star actually meant. People who were close to him during that period later recalled that Belfort often had very quiet moments amid all the noise. After fights, when the reporters left and the fans went home, he sometimes just sat alone in the locker room, not because he was sad, but because he was trying to sort out what was happening to his life. Fame has a very special way of changing how the world sees you. Before, Belfort was just a young fighter. Now every move he made was watched, every win was dissected, and any loss, if it ever happened, would be talked about everywhere. For a guy just stepping into adulthood, that was an enormous pressure. While the world saw a ferocious warrior with lightning-fast punches, inside Belfort still carried the sensitivity of the boy who grew up in a loving family in Rio. He began to feel something that many young celebrities have experienced but rarely talk about: the feeling that his life was running faster than he was. The fights kept coming, the wins kept adding to his record. Belfort became one of the most talked about names in the UFC by the end of the 1990s. But alongside all of that, a question started to emerge in his mind. Not a question about who he could beat next, but a much deeper one. He started wondering whose life he was really living. Was this the life he had dreamed of back when he was a kid training boxing in Rio? Or was this a path he had been swept into too quickly to even think about? To the fans, Belfort was a phenomenon, a knockout machine, a fighter born to fight. But to himself, the journey was only just beginning, and it was far more complicated than what anyone saw on the surface, because beneath the blinding light of fame, another part of Belfort was still searching for answers about who he really was. He began to realize that fame didn't just bring glory, it also brought responsibility, pressure, and questions that didn't always have answers. And while the world was obsessed with the phenomenon called the Phenom, it was actually Vitor Belfort who felt like he was walking through a life he didn't fully understand yet. But back then, he was still too young to know that the real challenges of his life were still ahead. The fights inside the octagon, no matter how brutal, were only a small part of the long story that Belfort was about to go through. Because fame can come very fast, but maturity and the real lessons of life often arrive in much more painful ways. And for Vitor Belfort, the years ahead would prove that in ways no one, including himself, could have imagined. The early years of fame passed like a whirlwind. Vitor Belfort continued stepping into the octagon, continued fighting, continued becoming one of the most talked about names in the UFC. Fans saw the knockouts. The press talked about his speed. Commentators called him one of the most explosive fighters of his generation. But life, as Belfort would realize many times later, never has just one single story. While his career was moving forward, a quiet but cruel event was waiting ahead. And when it happened, it would change his life in ways no victory could ever make up for. In 2004, a day that seemed completely ordinary began like any other for the Belfort family. Vitor's sister, Priscilla Belfort, left home to go to work. She was grown up by then, had her own life, and like so many young people in Rio de Janeiro, she was busy with her job and plans for the future. There was no sign that that day would become one of the most painful days in their family's history. Before leaving, Priscilla made one last phone call. A short, normal conversation, nothing out of the ordinary. No one knew it would be the last time they would hear her voice. After that call, Priscilla disappeared. At first, everyone thought maybe she was just busy or stuck somewhere. The first few hours passed with mild worry. But as time dragged on, the worry turned into real fear. The family started calling her friends, her co-workers, anyone who might know where she was. No one had answers. And then the police were called. The investigation began almost immediately. Officers tried to reconstruct the last hours before Priscilla vanished. They asked about the routes she usually took. They asked about the last people who saw her. They reviewed phone calls, the smallest details that might lead to a trace. But day after day passed with no news, no clear witnesses, no specific leads, just a growing void. In the weeks that followed, news of Priscilla Belfort's disappearance began to spread. When people realized she was the sister of one of Brazil's most famous fighters, the story quickly drew media attention. TV shows talked about the case. Newspapers printed her picture. Hosts urged viewers to provide information. But along with the public attention came rumors. Some said she might have been kidnapped. Others suspected she had become a victim of organized crime, something not uncommon in a big city like Rio. There were even darker theories, stories about gangs, about conflicts the Belfort family didn't even know about. But it was all just speculation. No theory was proven. No explanation was clear enough to bring peace to the family. Vitor Belfort was at a crucial stage in his career at the time. Big fights were waiting for him. But when news of Priscilla's disappearance reached him, everything else seemed to lose meaning. Close people later said he returned to Brazil almost immediately to be with the family. For Belfort, Priscilla wasn't just a sister. She was the one who had been there from the very beginning, who had listened to the dreams of the boy who once trained in a small gym in Rio. The thought that she might be out there somewhere, in danger, was something he couldn't accept. The Belfort family began living in a state of painful waiting. Every phone call could be news. Every knock at the door could be an answer. But day after day, nothing changed. The police kept investigating. They chased leads, questioned possible connections, but every path seemed to lead to a dead end. And the cruelest thing about disappearances like this is the silence. No explanation, no clear ending, just questions repeating over and over in the minds of those left behind. Vitor Belfort continued competing in the years that followed, but those who observed him closely noticed that a part of him had changed. When he stepped into the cage, he was still the Phenom, fast, explosive, dangerous. But when the lights went out and the fans left, he returned to a reality no wind could fix. The pain of loss isn't like wounds from a fight. It has no moment of closure. It has no referee to stop it. It just exists, quietly, through every passing day. For the Belfort family, life after the day Priscilla disappeared was never the same again. Family meals still happened, but there was always an empty chair. Holidays still came, but there was always a silence no one knew how to fill. They kept hoping, kept praying that one day the truth would be found, but months and years passed without an answer. For Vitor Belfort, that event became a deep wound in his life. It was the memory of a sister who had once been the center of his childhood, and it was also a reminder that even if a person can win inside the octagon, there are battles in life where strength, speed, or fame can't help you win. The Belfort family kept living, but they lived with a void no one could fill, a void created by one seemingly ordinary day, when Priscilla Belfort left home, made one last call, and then vanished from their world forever. Priscilla's disappearance didn't just leave a void in the Belfort family, it left a deep crack in Vitor's soul that no one could see from the outside. In the first weeks after his sister went missing, he lived almost entirely in a state of waiting. The phone was always by his side. Any call could be news. Any piece of information, no matter how small, could be a clue. But time passed, and the silence stretched on. Eventually, Belfort had to return to the life the world expected from him. He had to go back to training. He had to step back into the cage. He had to keep being the Phenom that fans still wanted to see. But when he walked into the gym, nothing felt the same anymore. The punches were still fast. The body was still strong. But his mind was somewhere else. In the quiet moments between sparring rounds, one question kept repeating in his head, non-stop. Where is my sister? That question had no answer, and it was the very absence of an answer that wore him down the most. The people training with Belfort started noticing the change. Before, he trained with near-total focus. But after the event, there were days he became so quiet it was unsettling. There were days he trained with furious intensity, as if trying to punch through an invisible wall in front of him. And there were days he just stood staring at the mat, as if his mind was very far away. When Belfort returned to competing, fans still saw the same explosive fighter, but inside, everything was different. MMA had once been passion, a path, a dream. Now it became something far more complicated. When he stepped into the octagon, Belfort wasn't just fighting the opponent in front of him, he was fighting the pain he carried with him. There were fights where he entered with an almost uncontrollable rage. His punches became more brutal, more ferocious. But even when he won, the emptiness didn't go away, because a win in the cage didn't bring his sister back. And there were fights where that pain threw him off balance. In the years after the event, Belfort began experiencing losses he had rarely faced before. Some opponents beat him with strategy. Some fights ended in ways that surprised the audience. The media started asking questions. They wondered what was happening to the Phenom. Some said Belfort had lost his edge. Others thought the sport was changing, and new fighters were catching up to him. But those who truly understood the story knew something else was going on. Belfort wasn't just fighting other fighters. He was fighting his own pain. Every time he stepped into the cage, he carried memories of Priscilla. He carried the image of the sister who once sat listening to him talk about his early training sessions as a kid. He carried the question that was never answered. Where is my sister? MMA had once been the place where Belfort found clarity. In the cage, everything used to be so simple. There was an opponent. There was a strategy. There was win or lose. But after the event, the octagon became something else. It became the place where he unleashed his anger, unleashed his pain, unleashed all the emotions he didn't know how to put into words. There were fights where Belfort entered like a storm, not because of strategy, but because inside him too much was exploding. But the problem with rage is that it doesn't always bring victory. Sometimes it makes you lose control, and in a brutal sport like MMA, losing control can cost you dearly. The losses started coming more often. Each loss brought disappointment, not just from the fans, but from Belfort himself. He began to wonder if he was still the fighter who had once stunned the entire UFC. But deep down, he knew the bigger question wasn't about martial arts. The bigger question was how to keep living with a pain that had no end. Many fighters facing crisis turned to isolation, but Belfort kept trying to stay in the rhythm of training and competing. Because if he stopped for too long, the thoughts in his head would become too heavy. So he kept fighting, kept stepping into the cage, kept doing the only thing he knew how to do when the world became chaotic: fight. But during those years, there was one truth that Belfort began to realize. There are battles you can't win with strength. There are wounds no punch can heal. And there are questions that even time can't answer. In the eyes of the fans, Vitor Belfort was still a warrior. But inside, he was going through one of the hardest periods of his life. A period where fame couldn't help, money couldn't help, and wins in the cage couldn't erase the pain. That was the moment when Vitor Belfort began to understand that his life wasn't just the story of a fighter. It was the story of a man trying to find a way to stand after his world had been torn apart. But sometimes, it's exactly when a person reaches the lowest point in their life that they begin to find a different path. A path that doesn't rely only on the strength of muscles, but on something much deeper. And for Vitor Belfort, that path was about to appear in a way he had never imagined before. The years after Priscilla's disappearance felt like a long tunnel for Vitor Belfort. He kept competing, kept stepping into the octagon, kept hearing thousands of fans chanting his name, but inside, he felt like he was living in a darkness with no way out. The unanswered questions, the memories of his sister, and the helplessness in the face of the world's silence drained him in ways no one in the stands could see. There were days Belfort woke up feeling like he was carrying a burden too heavy to bear. Not the burden of fame, not the pressure of fights. It was the burden of pain that had never been released. And it was in those moments of despair that Belfort began searching for something else. Something that wasn't in the gym, wasn't in fight strategy, and wasn't in his punches. He began turning to religion. To many on the outside, this change came as quite a surprise. But for Belfort, it happened very naturally. When a person has tried every way to stay standing and still feels like they're about to collapse, they often turn to the one place they believe can give meaning to their pain. And for Belfort, that place was faith. He started attending prayer sessions. At first, they were just quiet moments where he could say things he had never said to anyone before. He spoke about his sister. He spoke about his family's pain. He spoke about the helplessness in the face of questions with no answers. And in the stillness of those prayers, Belfort began to feel something he hadn't felt in many years. Peace. Not complete peace, because the pain was still there, but at least he no longer felt like he was fighting alone. Christianity gradually became an anchor in Belfort's life. He started reading the Bible. He talked with people of deep faith. And little by little, the way he saw the world began to change. Before, he viewed life like a series of fights, win or lose, strong or weak. But faith made him see everything differently. It taught him that some pains can't be explained, but they can still be carried without destroying who you are. That change didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process, like someone learning to stand steady after a storm. But the people around Belfort started noticing the difference. He became calmer, less angry, and there was a new certainty in the way he talked about life. When Belfort returned to the cage, fans began to see a new image. Before fights started, he would often kneel on the mat. He closed his eyes. He prayed. To many TV viewers, it was just a brief moment before the action began, but for Belfort, it was a very personal ritual, a way to remind himself that his life wasn't just about winning or losing. He began speaking about faith in interviews. He said that God had helped him get through the darkest years of his life. At first, some in the media thought it was just for show. In the sports world, athletes talking about faith isn't uncommon, but for Belfort, it was different. The people who truly knew him understood that this wasn't an image-building strategy. This was what had kept him from falling apart. Because when Priscilla disappeared, Belfort had stood before a void that no amount of strength could fill, and faith was the only thing that helped him walk through that void without losing himself. From then on, every time Belfort stepped into the octagon, he didn't just bring his martial arts skills, he brought something else, the belief that his life had meaning greater than any fight. That didn't slow down his punches. If anything changed, it made him more focused, no longer fighting out of pure anger, no longer fighting just to prove something to the world. He fought because it was his path, and because he believed he still had a purpose in life. In the years that followed, the image of Belfort kneeling in prayer before fights became a familiar sight to MMA fans, but few understood that behind that moment was a long journey of pain and searching. It was the journey of a man who had walked through despair and found a way to keep living, and it was from the moment Belfort found faith that his story began to enter a new chapter, a chapter where his strength wasn't just in the punches inside the octagon, but also in his ability to stand firm after the losses life had placed on his shoulders. After finding faith, Vitor Belfort's life began to gradually stabilize again. Not because the pain had disappeared. It was still there, like a scar that never fully heals. But now he had a way to carry it without letting it destroy him. Belfort returned to training with a new kind of focus. The sessions became more disciplined, with clearer goals, and little by little, his form started coming back. UFC fans once again saw what they had known so well: terrifying speed, explosive punches, and a ferocity that left opponents with little chance to react. But this time there was something different. Belfort was no longer fighting just to vent anger. He fought with a deeper calm. Each fight felt like a step forward in the journey to rediscover himself. The peak of this period came in 2004, when Belfort stepped into the fight for the UFC light heavyweight championship against Randy Couture, one of the most experienced and respected fighters in MMA. For many fans, it wasn't an easy matchup for Belfort. Couture wasn't just strong, he was extremely smart with his tactics. But that night, Belfort entered the octagon with absolute focus. When the fight began, the entire arena was filled with tension. The two fighters circled the cage, probing each other in the first few seconds. Then the decisive moment happened so fast that many fans had to watch the slow-motion replay to fully understand it. One punch from Belfort caused severe damage to Couture's eye. The fight was stopped, and in just seconds, the referee declared it over. Vitor Belfort became the UFC light heavyweight champion. The whole arena erupted. Fans leaped to their feet cheering. TV cameras pointed at him from every angle. Commentators shouted that the Phenom was back on top. To many people, it was the perfect moment. A fighter who had gone through tough years had returned and claimed the title of one of the biggest MMA organizations in the world. Belfort stood in the center of the octagon, the gold belt placed on his shoulders, lights shining throughout the arena. But in that moment, as the cheers echoed everywhere, his mind drifted to a completely different place. He thought of Priscilla. He thought of the sister who once sat listening to him talk about his early martial arts training as a kid. He thought of the days when the two siblings were just children in Rio, when the future still seemed simple and the world couldn't hurt them. And in that moment, amid all the glory, Belfort realized something very few people around him could understand. He had achieved what millions of fighters dream of. He had become a UFC champion. But even the biggest win of his career couldn't bring his sister back. No belt could fill the void that Priscilla's disappearance had left in his life. No amount of cheering could erase the question that had lingered in his mind for so many years. Where is my sister? The people watching Belfort in that moment only saw a champion. They saw a fighter raising the gold belt, smiling in front of thousands of fans. But inside him, the emotions were far more complex. Pride, gratitude, but also a quiet sadness that no one could see. Belfort later said many times that that victory didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to his family, to his parents, who had stood strong through the difficult years, and especially, it belonged to Priscilla. In his mind, his sister had always been a part of that journey. But the win also brought a truth that many champions have to face. Reaching the top doesn't always bring the peace people expect. After becoming champion, Belfort continued stepping into bigger fights, bigger stages, but the feeling of emptiness still came back from time to time. Not because he wasn't grateful for what he had, but because he understood that some things in life can't be fixed by victory. Still, that very realization made Belfort more mature. He began to see his career in a different way, not just a race to win more titles, but a much longer journey, where every fight was a part of the story of his life. In the eyes of the fans, Vitor Belfort was still the Phenom, the fighter with lightning-fast knockouts. But to himself, the UFC championship belt was a reminder that success and loss can exist at the same time, that a person can stand at the peak of their career and still carry voids that no title can fill. And perhaps that very truth is what makes Vitor Belfort's story so special, because he wasn't just a champion inside the octagon. He was a man learning how to keep living with the wounds life had left him. But Belfort's life, like that of many great fighters, didn't always follow a straight line. After the peak, new challenges began to appear, and this time, those challenges didn't just come from opponents in the cage, but from doubt, controversy, and the pressure of a constantly changing world. Once again, Vitor Belfort would have to face a familiar question: how long could he stand strong when the whole world started doubting him? After reaching the peak and winning the UFC championship belt, many people believed that Vitor Belfort had completed his story. In the eyes of the fans, it was the perfect journey. A young phenomenon stepping into the UFC, going through personal tragedy, then coming back and becoming champion. But in the world of MMA, the peak is rarely the end. It's often just the beginning of new challenges. And sometimes those challenges don't come from opponents inside the cage, but from the doubt of the outside world. The years after Belfort won the title were a time when MMA began changing rapidly. A new generation of fighters emerged, techniques evolved, and the rules for competing became stricter. At the same time, Belfort's body, like that of any athlete who had gone through many years of brutal fighting, started showing signs of time. Minor injuries appeared more frequently, recovery became more difficult, and in that context, Belfort began using a treatment method that would later become the center of much controversy: TRT, short for testosterone replacement therapy. TRT was initially seen as a medical method to help people with low testosterone levels restore hormonal balance in their bodies. In sports, some athletes were granted permission to use TRT for medical reasons. Belfort was among the fighters approved to use this method during certain periods of his career. But in the world of MMA, where fans are always sensitive to anything related to physical advantages, TRT quickly became a topic of intense debate. The media started asking questions. Some commentators argued that TRT gave Belfort an unfair edge. Articles appeared with skeptical headlines. Martial arts forums were filled with debates about whether Belfort was still the natural fighter he once was. For many fans, the image of the Phenom began to become more complicated. Some still saw in him a resilient warrior who had overcome personal tragedy to keep competing. But others started doubting. They said Belfort had changed. They said he wasn't himself anymore. The criticism grew louder. Every win Belfort had during this period was analyzed from a different angle. It was no longer just about technique, speed, or strategy. People started asking, was this win because of TRT? For Belfort, it was a difficult period in a completely different way from the fights inside the octagon. Because in the cage, at least everything was clear. There was an opponent in front of him. There were rules. There was a result. But in the battle with public opinion, everything became much more blurred. The criticism didn't come from a single opponent. It came from everywhere, from journalists, from fans online, from endless discussions on sports television. And sometimes, what made it hardest for Belfort wasn't the criticism itself, but the feeling that part of his legacy was being questioned. For many years, he had been known as one of the most explosive fighters in MMA history. But now, every time his name was mentioned, it often came with a debate. However, just like the difficult periods before in his life, Belfort didn't completely collapse under the world's doubt. People close to him said that during this time, his faith became more important than ever. When the media argued, when fans were divided, Belfort found stability in the things that didn't change: family, faith, and discipline in training. He kept stepping into the cage, kept fighting dangerous opponents, and even as the controversy continued, no one could deny one truth. When the fight started, Belfort was still a terrifying fighter. But this period changed the way the world looked at him. It was no longer the simple story of a young phenomenon. It became the story of a fighter battling to defend his reputation in an increasingly harsh environment. For many athletes, years of being doubted can destroy a career, but for Vitor Belfort, it became another chapter in his turbulent journey. A chapter where he had to learn how to live with not everyone believing in him. And it was right from the middle of those controversies that Belfort once again did what he had done many times in his life. He found a way to stand back up, because no matter what the world doubted, he still believed his story wasn't over. And in the years that followed, Vitor Belfort would prove that even after all the controversy and doubt, the Phenom still had one final chapter to write in his career. After many years under the doubtful spotlight of the media and fans, many people believed that Vitor Belfort's story was gradually coming to an end. MMA is a brutal sport where age rarely forgives anyone. Younger, faster fighters trained in more modern systems were appearing everywhere. In the eyes of many commentators, Belfort seemed to belong to an older generation, a legend from the past, but no longer a real threat to the fighters dominating the new weight classes. But if there's one thing Vitor Belfort's history has proven time and again, it's that he never completely fades from the fight. When he entered his 30s, a time when many MMA fighters start thinking about retirement, Belfort stepped into one of the most explosive phases of his career. His body may have gone through many years of brutal competition, but his hands were still lightning fast. And this time, every fight wasn't just a sporting contest, it was a statement that all the doubts, all the controversies, and all the painful years he had endured could not destroy who he was. One of the most memorable moments of this period came when Belfort faced Michael Bisping. Bisping was an extremely confident fighter at the time, famous for his pre-fight trash talk and his durable fighting style. Before the fight, many thought it would be a major challenge for Belfort, but when the fight began, everything unfolded in the way only Belfort could create. In just a few minutes, an incredibly precise spinning back kick from him sent Bisping crashing to the mat. The entire arena exploded. Once again, the MMA world witnessed what had stunned them many years earlier, the speed and explosiveness of the Phenom. Not long after, Belfort stunned fans again when he faced Luke Rockhold, one of the youngest and most dangerous fighters in the middleweight division at the time. Rockhold was seen as a representative of the new generation, young, tall, with well-rounded technique. But when the two stepped into the cage, Belfort once more proved that his experience and fighting instinct hadn't vanished. A spinning back kick to Rockhold's head ended the fight in almost perfect fashion. The image of Rockhold collapsing to the mat and Belfort raising his hands in celebration quickly became one of the most famous knockout moments in UFC history. But perhaps the most emotionally significant moment for Belfort was the fight against Dan Henderson. Henderson wasn't just a dangerous opponent, he was an MMA legend, a fighter respected throughout the martial arts world. When the fight started, many predicted it would be a long, tense battle. But Belfort did what he had done throughout his career. He ended the fight explosively. A flurry of lightning-fast punches dropped Henderson to the mat, and the fight concluded amid the audience's shock. 3 wins, 3 knockouts, and each victory forced the MMA world to look at Vitor Belfort once again. But for Belfort, these wins carried a completely different meaning than in the early years of his career. When he was young, each knockout was like a milestone on the road to becoming a star. Back then, victory was tied to fame, to the excitement of the crowd, and to the dream of becoming champion. But at this stage of his life, Belfort had changed. He was no longer fighting just to be famous. He no longer stepped into the cage just to prove he was stronger than his opponent. Each win now carried a deeper message. It was an affirmation that all the pain he had gone through, the disappearance of Priscilla, the years of doubt, the media controversies could not destroy him. When he stood in the center of the octagon after those victories, Belfort was no longer the explosive 19-year-old from the early UFC days. He was a man who had gone through events many couldn't imagine. A man who understood that true strength isn't just in the speed of punches, but in the ability to rise after life tries to knock you down. To the fans, those knockouts felt like the return of a legend. But to Belfort, it was something far more personal. Every time an opponent went down, every time the referee raised his hand, it was like a reminder that pain isn't the end of the story. it's only part of the journey. And no matter how much the world doubted or changed, Vitor Belfort kept doing what he had done his entire life, getting back up, stepping into the cage, and fighting. But after all those wins and that spectacular resurgence, another question began to emerge in his mind. Not how many more fights he could win, but what his life outside the octagon would look like when the final bell of his career rang. And that very question would take Vitor Belfort's story into another chapter, where the world began to see the real person behind the warrior known as the Phenom. After all the years of fighting inside the octagon, after all the time standing under blinding lights and hearing thousands of fans chanting his name, Vitor Belfort gradually realized that his life wasn't defined solely by those fights. In the eyes of the world, he was always the Phenom, the fighter with explosive knockouts, the man whose hands moved so fast that opponents couldn't react in time. But outside the cage there was another person, one that fans rarely got to see. That was Vitor Belfort as a husband, a father, and a man trying to build a peaceful life after so many years living amid the violence and pressure of MMA. At the center of that private life was Joana Prado. Joana wasn't an unfamiliar name in Brazil. Before meeting Belfort, she had been a well-known model and television personality, recognized by the public for her strong personality and confidence. But when the two met, their relationship wasn't built just on fame. It was built on something much deeper: understanding. Belfort was going through a complicated phase of his life at the time: personal tragedies, the grueling years of competition, and his sister's disappearance had left wounds that no one on the outside could fully comprehend. Joana became the person by his side during those moments, not as a fan but as a true companion. They married in 2003, and from then on, Belfort's life began to have a steadier anchor. In the world of MMA, where many fighters live on constant flights and high-stakes fights, maintaining a solid family isn't easy. But for Belfort, family gradually became the center of everything. He and Joana had 3 children, 1 son and 2 daughters. When the kids were born, Belfort started seeing life in a different way. Before, most of his time had been devoted to the gym and fights. But when he came home and saw his son and daughters running to hug him, he realized there were things in life more important than any championship belt. People who visited the Belfort family often said that the image of him at home was completely different from the one on television. In the octagon, Belfort was a warrior. His eyes were cold and sharp, his body tense, and every movement carried power. But at home, he was a gentle father. He played with the kids, helped them with homework, and sometimes just sat quietly listening to them talk about their day at school. There were evenings when Belfort came home after a long day of training and still made time to read books to the children before they went to sleep. To the kids, their dad wasn't a famous fighter. He was simply the man who was always there to hug them when they were sad, to laugh when they told a silly story, and to teach them that real strength isn't in defeating others, but in protecting the people you love. Joana said many times that family life helped Belfort stay balanced during the toughest years of his career, when the media argued about him, when losses left him disappointed, when memories of Priscilla came flooding back. Family was the only place he could return to and feel peace. Right there, Belfort didn't need to be the Phenom. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He just needed to be Vitor, a husband, a father, a man trying to live the best he could after everything life had placed on his shoulders. For many fans, this image might be hard to imagine. They were used to Belfort as a ferocious warrior who could end a fight in seconds. But it's precisely that contrast that makes his story so special, because Belfort's life has always existed in 2 parallel worlds. One world is the octagon, where he fights, where he became one of the most feared fighters in MMA history. And the other world is his home, where children's laughter fills the air, where he sits with his wife after a long day, and where he remembers he isn't just a fighter. It was in those peaceful moments that Belfort began to understand more clearly the meaning of his life. Fights can end, titles can be passed to someone else, but family isn't decided by a referee's bell. And for Vitor Belfort, the man the world knows as a warrior, perhaps his most important role isn't as a UFC champion, it's as a husband and a father, the real person that most of the world has never seen. But even though family life brought him peace, the story of Belfort's 2 lives still hasn't been fully understood, because behind all the fights, all the titles, and all the warm family moments, there remains a truth that only becomes clear when looking back at his entire journey. A truth about the 2 people who have existed side by side throughout 30 years of Vitor Belfort's life, and that is something the world is only beginning to realize as his story moves into the next chapter. After many years of seeing Vitor Belfort as an explosive fighter inside the octagon, many people began to realize that his story couldn't be understood just through the fights, because Belfort's life has always existed with two parallel images, two seemingly opposing people living within the same identity. And that is the true meaning of what many later called the double life, Vitor Belfort's two-faced existence. But Belfort's double life isn't some dark secret. It isn't a story of wrongdoing or things he tried to hide from the world. In reality, it's a very human contrast. On one side is the image fans see every time the arena lights come on, a ferocious warrior fast as lightning, ready to charge at his opponent with power that makes the entire stadium hold its breath. That is the Phenom, the fighter with knockouts in mere seconds, the one who made many MMA legends fall. Inside the octagon, Belfort almost becomes a different person. His eyes change, his body moves with the explosiveness of someone born to fight. His punches carry a force few fighters can withstand. To the audience, it's the image of a warrior who seems to know no fear. But outside the cage, there exists a completely different person. A man carrying wounds no one can see when the cameras turn off. A son who still remembers his family in Rio. A brother still living with the memory of his sister Priscilla, the one who vanished from his life without leaving any answers. And a father trying to teach his children that true strength isn't just in defeating opponents. Throughout 30 years, those two people have existed side by side in Vitor Belfort's life. One is known to the whole world, the Phenom, the icon of power and speed in the UFC, and the other is seen by few, Vitor, the man carrying deep pain but still trying to live with faith and love for his family. This contrast sometimes makes people find it hard to understand. How can one person be both a ferocious warrior in the cage and a gentle father at home? How can a fighter unleash punches that drop opponents in seconds, yet carry a heart wounded for years by his sister's disappearance? But perhaps it's exactly that contrast that defines the real Belfort. Because life isn't always simple. A person can be strong in one moment and vulnerable in the next. A person can win in the cage, yet still carry pains no fight can resolve. And for Belfort, those two lives have never been separate. The wins in the UFC didn't make him forget Priscilla. The titles didn't erase the pain, but on the contrary, that very pain sometimes became the source of strength that kept him fighting. Many people later said that without those life events, Belfort might have become a completely different fighter. He might have just been a martial arts star, a speed phenomenon in the octagon, but those losses made his story deeper. They made him not just a fighter, but a human being trying to find meaning in what life brought him. When looking back at Belfort's journey, people start to understand that his double life isn't pretense, it's the reality of so many people. On the outside they show strength, on the inside they carry wounds few know about. And perhaps the most admirable thing about Belfort isn't the knockouts or the UFC titles. The most admirable thing is that he never let the pain destroy who he was. He didn't run from the memory of his sister. He didn't deny the difficult years. Instead, he carried them as part of his life. Two lives, two people, one warrior the whole world sees, and one quiet man that only his family and closest people truly understand. Throughout 30 years, those two people have coexisted in Vitor Belfort's life. And when looking back at that journey, people begin to realize that it's precisely that contrast that created a story not just about martial arts, but about human strength in the face of the challenges life imposes. But like every long journey, Belfort's life eventually moves toward a quieter phase. After many years living under the bright lights of arenas, he starts thinking more about what will remain when the final bell of his career rings. And it's in that quietness that a new chapter in Vitor Belfort's life begins to take shape. A chapter no longer centered on fights, but on rediscovering peace after all the storms he has weathered. After many years living under the blinding lights of arenas, after hundreds of grueling training sessions and battles that left the whole world holding its breath, Vitor Belfort's life finally shifted to a different rhythm. No more nights stepping into the octagon with thousands of fans roaring. No more tense pre-fight press conferences. No more months where every morning began with the question, when is the next fight? When Belfort left the UFC, many fans felt like an era was coming to a close. The Phenom, the kid who once stunned the entire world with his explosive speed and power, was now stepping out of the cage for the last time. But for Belfort, it wasn't the end of his life. It was just the beginning of another chapter. A quieter one, but perhaps a deeper one too. The Belfort family moved to Florida, where the warm climate and slower pace of life were a far cry from the years he spent constantly traveling between cities for fights. There, his life gradually became simpler. Mornings no longer started with heavy training sessions to prepare for battle. Instead, there were walks, light workouts to stay healthy, and much more time devoted to family. Belfort began spending more days at home with his wife and children. The small things he sometimes had to miss because of fight schedules now became an important part of life. Family dinners, weekend outings, evenings sitting and talking with the kids about school and their dreams. For someone who had spent most of his life in the violent world of MMA, those peaceful moments held special value. But Belfort didn't completely walk away from martial arts. After so many years of competing, martial arts had become part of who he was. So instead of fighting in the octagon, he began passing his experience on to the next generation. In Florida, Belfort got involved in coaching and mentoring young fighters just starting their MMA careers. Young guys stepped into the gym with the same eager eyes Belfort once had when he trained under Carlson Gracie. And in those moments he saw himself from many years ago. He taught them not just how to throw a faster punch or escape a hold on the mat. He taught them lessons only someone who had been through many battles could understand. He told them that martial arts isn't just about strength, it's about discipline, patience, and sometimes the ability to get back up after life knocks you down. The young fighters often looked at Belfort with special respect. To them he wasn't just a coach, he was part of MMA history, someone who once stepped into the octagon and changed the way the world saw the sport. But for Belfort, coaching carried a different meaning. It let him stay connected to the sport that had shaped so much of his life, without living under the pressure of competing. These years were also a time when Belfort began reflecting more on the journey he had taken. Looking back, he saw a life full of ups and downs, from the Rio kid stepping into his first martial arts gym, to the 19-year-old who stunned the UFC, to becoming champion. Then the years of crisis, controversy, and spectacular resurgence, and woven through it all was a wound that never fully healed: Priscilla's disappearance. But over time, Belfort learned to carry that memory in a different way. It was no longer just pain. It became part of the story that made him the man he is today. On quiet evenings in Florida, sometimes Belfort sat with his family on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. Moments like that rarely appear in the life of a professional fighter. But for him, they brought a sense of peace that no victory in the octagon could ever provide. Belfort's life slowed down, not because he lost strength or desire, but because he had moved past the phase where everything had to be proven through wins. Now, he could live at his own pace, and as the MMA world kept changing with new generations of fighters, Vitor Belfort remained there, not as a warrior in the cage anymore, but still part of the bigger story of the sport. A man who once fought in front of millions, now finding meaning in helping others begin their own journeys. But when looking back at his entire life, Belfort understood that his legacy wasn't just in the fights or the knockouts. It lay in something much deeper, something people only truly understand when a long journey comes to an end. And it was from the peace of those post-career years that the final question about Vitor Belfort's legacy began to emerge. A question no longer about winning or losing, but about the true meaning of the life he had lived. When looking back at Vitor Belfort's entire journey, it's easy to get swept up in the explosive moments inside the octagon. The lightning-fast knockouts. The fights that ended before many fans even realized what had happened. The image of a fighter charging forward with speed that left opponents in panic. In MMA history, very few people have had the ability to finish fights the way Belfort did over decades. He wasn't just a champion. He was one of the greatest knockout artists the sport has ever seen. Right from his early days stepping into the UFC, Belfort left the whole world stunned. A teenage kid walked into the toughest competition on the planet and defeated bigger, stronger opponents in just minutes. Back then, the UFC was still a wild frontier of martial arts, where fighters from all different backgrounds tried to prove their style was the strongest. And amid all those people, a boy from Rio de Janeiro appeared with speed and explosiveness that made every rule seem meaningless. The Phenom wasn't just a nickname, it was an accurate description of what fans were witnessing, a phenomenon. A talent that arrived too early, too strong, and too different from the rest of the MMA world at the time. Over the years, the list of opponents Belfort defeated became part of the sport's history, from his first UFC fights to matchups against legends and knockouts that made entire arenas erupt. But if you only look at the record, you miss the most important part of the story, because what makes Vitor Belfort a legend isn't just the wins, It's the way he lived through things most people never have to face. When he was still very young, Belfort stepped into the spotlight of fame, but fame never became armor that protected him from tragedy. When his sister Priscilla disappeared from the Belfort family's life, it wasn't something that could be resolved with a fight. There was no opponent in the octagon for him to defeat. No championship belt could bring her back. Just a void that stretched on year after year, a question that never got an answer, and a family that had to learn how to live with that pain. For Belfort, that loss became part of his life. It followed him into every fight, every training session, every time he stepped out in front of thousands of fans. The world saw an explosive warrior, but deep inside, he was still a little brother trying to understand what had happened to his sister. Many people might have collapsed under a tragedy like that. Many might have let that pain destroy their lives. But Belfort chose a different path. He kept fighting, not because he didn't feel the pain, but because he understood that if he stopped, that pain would swallow everything. Martial arts in some way became how he kept moving forward, a way to turn anger, loss, and helplessness into something he could control. And throughout that journey, Belfort also gradually changed. The young man who once entered the UFC with explosive speed became a man who understood that true strength isn't just in muscles or technique, it's in the ability to rise after life tries to knock you down. In the final years of his career, when Belfort stepped into the cage at an age when many fighters had long retired, fans no longer just saw a warrior, they saw a story. A man who had weathered too many storms but still kept moving forward. The knockouts against opponents like Michael Bisping, Luke Rockhold, or Dan Henderson weren't just sporting victories, they were reminders that human will can outlast any doubt. And then, when his career came to a close, Belfort stepped into another phase of life. No more bells signaling the start of a fight, no more blinding arena lights, just a peaceful life with family, training sessions with young fighters, and slower days. But even after leaving the octagon, Belfort's legacy continues to live in the MMA world. Young fighters still watch his fights to understand what real knockout speed looks like. Longtime fans still talk about the Phenom as an icon of the early UFC era. But Belfort's legacy isn't just in highlight videos. It lies in the story of a man who lived two parallel lives for 30 years, a warrior the whole world saw, and a quiet man carrying his family's pain. When looking back, people realize that Vitor Belfort's story isn't just about martial arts. It's about being human, about how a person can live with wounds no one sees, about how a person can keep getting back up even after life has tested him over and over. In the world of sports, many champions are remembered for the belts they won, for the fights they conquered. But sometimes what makes a person a legend lies in things that don't show up on the record sheet. And when MMA history is retold, Vitor Belfort will always appear as part of that story, not just as a great knockout artist, not just as the youngest phenomenon to ever step into the UFC, but as a warrior who lived his entire life between the light of victory and the shadow of loss. Because in the end, his legacy isn't just the fights. His legacy is the way he survived the pain most of the world never saw. And perhaps the truest closing line for Vitor Belfort's story isn't in any championship belt. It lies in a much simpler truth. Some fighters are remembered for the fights they win. Vitor Belfort will be remembered for the pain he survived. The story of Vitor Belfort leaves a feeling that is both sorrowful and deeply respectful, because behind the image of the Phenom, with his lightning-fast knockouts inside the octagon, is a man who has had to carry wounds that no fight could ever heal. In the story, we clearly see the profound contrast between the two lives of this man. On one side is the 19-year-old fighter who left the entire UFC stunned when he took down opponents in the very first seconds of his career, becoming the youngest phenomenon in the sport. But on the other side is the little brother who has lived for decades with the question, "Where is my sister?" after his sister Priscilla mysteriously vanished from the family's life. That very detail makes every one of Belfort's victories feel heavier, because even when he stood in the center of the cage with the championship belt and the roar of the crowd, in his mind there was still an emptiness that could never be filled. What makes people honor Belfort isn't just the famous knockouts against Michael Bisping, Luke Rockhold, or Dan Henderson, but the way he kept getting back up after crisis, found an anchor in faith, and built a peaceful family with Joanna Prado and their 3 children. The image of a ferocious warrior in the cage, who is also a gentle father at home, shows that true human strength doesn't lie only in victory, but in the ability to keep living after tragedy. For American society, where many people face pressure, loss, or personal crisis, Belfort's story reminds us that success doesn't mean a life without pain, but if a person can hold on to faith, family, and the will to rise after deep losses, then even the greatest wounds can become a source of strength to keep going and inspire others. If the story of Vitor Belfort's journey full of loss but also full of resilience makes you think, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the extraordinary lives behind sports legends. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and see you in the next video where we'll open up another story about human strength, pain, and resilience.